In this episode, we take your understanding of risk and turn it into the kind of decision-making that shows up in real organizations and in exam scenarios. Choosing which controls to apply first. Most beginners assume security is about finding the perfect control and applying it everywhere, but real life does not work that way. Time, budget, staff, and system constraints mean you almost always have to prioritize. Control prioritization is the skill of deciding which safeguards will reduce the most risk for the least cost or disruption, given what matters most to the organization. The GISF exam often frames questions around what you should do first, what is most effective, or what best reduces risk in a specific situation. Our goal is to help you build a simple, repeatable way to select controls logically instead of guessing based on what sounds most technical. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first step in prioritization is remembering that controls exist to protect assets by reducing risk, and risk is shaped by likelihood and impact. That means you prioritize controls that reduce high-likelihood events, high-impact events, or both. A useful mental habit is to ask two questions when you see a scenario. How likely is this threat to succeed given the current weaknesses, and how bad would it be if it did? If the scenario describes a common threat, like phishing targeting many employees, likelihood may be high. If it involves sensitive customer data or critical operations, impact may be high. Controls that directly reduce those factors often rise to the top. This approach keeps you focused on business consequences, not just technical features. Another major prioritization concept is addressing the biggest, most exposed weaknesses first. Some vulnerabilities act like open doors, meaning they are easy for attackers to exploit and can lead to large harm. Unpatched internet-facing systems, weak authentication, and excessive user privileges are classic examples of weaknesses that can dramatically raise risk. When you reduce these, you often reduce multiple risks at once. For example, strong authentication can reduce the likelihood of account takeover across many systems, not just one. This is sometimes described as getting the most risk reduction per unit of effort. On an exam question that asks what control best reduces risk broadly, answers that address widely shared weaknesses often outperform narrow solutions that only help one corner case. A practical way to think about controls is to separate them into preventive, detective, and corrective categories. Preventive controls stop incidents from happening. Detective controls help you notice incidents quickly, and corrective controls help you recover. When deciding what to prioritize, preventive controls often come first because preventing harm is usually cheaper than cleaning up afterward. However, prevention is rarely perfect, so you also need detection and recovery to handle what slips through. A beginner-friendly mindset is to build a balanced safety net, where prevention reduces the number of incidents, detection reduces the time to notice them, and recovery reduces the time and cost of returning to normal. In exam scenarios, the best answer often depends on whether the question is about stopping the incident, discovering it, or reducing damage after it happens. Now let's focus on controls that tend to be high value in many environments, because prioritization often means starting with fundamentals. Strong identity and access management is one of the highest value areas because so many attacks begin with unauthorized access. If accounts are well protected and privileges are appropriate, many threats become harder to execute. Another high-value area is patching and vulnerability management, because known software flaws are commonly exploited. Backups are also high value, especially for threats like ransomware that target availability. Security awareness training is high value when human behavior is a primary vulnerability, such as phishing and social engineering. Each of these controls targets a broad class of risk, which is why they are often prioritized early. It is important to understand that prioritization is not only about choosing the strongest control, it is about choosing the right control for the stated problem. For instance, if a scenario describes unauthorized changes to data, integrity is at stake, and a control that ensures change accountability may be more relevant than one that only protects confidentiality. If the scenario describes repeated service outages, Availability may be the main concern, and resilience controls like redundancy or recovery planning may matter most. Exam questions often include tempting answers that are technically impressive but do not align with the specific property being threatened. Your job is to match the control to the goal. If you do that consistently, many distractors become easy to eliminate. You also need to consider feasibility, because a control that is ideal but impossible to implement quickly may not be the best first step. For example, redesigning an entire network architecture might reduce risk significantly, but it could take months and require major operational disruption. A quicker control like tightening access, patching a known vulnerability, or adjusting monitoring might reduce risk immediately, while longer-term improvements are planned. Exam questions sometimes test this by asking about the first action to take, not the final perfect state. A realistic answer often includes actions that are achievable, targeted, and aligned with the threat described. As a beginner, you can use a simple filter. If a control requires major organizational transformation, it is probably not the first step unless the question explicitly frames a long-term project. Another concept that helps with prioritization is the idea of compensating controls. Sometimes the best control cannot be implemented due to technical limitations or business constraints, so you choose another control that reduces risk in a different way. For example, if a legacy system cannot support modern authentication, you might reduce exposure by restricting network access and increasing monitoring around that system. The key is that compensating controls should be deliberate and should address the same risk goal, even if indirectly. On the exam, when you see a scenario where ideal security is not possible, the correct answer may involve a reasonable alternative that reduces likelihood or impact. This reflects real-world decision-making, where perfect solutions are rare. Prioritization also relies on understanding dependencies between controls. Some controls enable others. For example, you cannot enforce least privilege effectively if you do not know which accounts exist and what they can access. You cannot recover from ransomware if you do not have reliable backups that are protected from being altered. You cannot patch effectively if you do not have an inventory of systems and a process for testing updates. This is why foundational governance, documentation, and asset management matter, even though they may feel less exciting than technical defenses. When exam questions ask about program building steps, answers that establish visibility and structure often come before answers that assume perfect knowledge and control. Let's walk through a simple scenario-style thought process to practice prioritization. Imagine an organization reports that employees keep falling for phishing emails, leading to credential theft. The asset is account access to systems, the threat is phishing, and the vulnerability is user susceptibility and perhaps weak authentication. A high-priority control could be multi-factor authentication because it reduces the impact of stolen passwords by requiring another factor. Another high-priority control might be security awareness training combined with improved email filtering because it reduces likelihood. Notice how these controls directly align with the described weakness. Choosing something like encrypting data at rest might still be useful, but it does not address the immediate path of compromise. This alignment is what exam questions often want you to demonstrate. Now consider a different scenario where the organization is hit by ransomware and cannot restore operations quickly. The immediate problem is availability and recovery capability. In that context, prioritization might focus on reliable backups, tested restoration procedures, and isolating backup storage from regular network access. Those controls reduce impact and speed recovery. Preventive measures like patching and user training are still important, but if the question asks what best helps recover or reduce downtime, recovery-related controls rise in priority. This is an example of how the same organization might prioritize different controls depending on the specific risk situation. Prioritization is dynamic, not fixed. A frequent beginner mistake is prioritizing controls based on fear rather than evidence. For example, people may focus on a rare advanced threat while ignoring common weaknesses like weak passwords or missing patches. A practical approach is to prioritize based on realistic threat frequency and asset importance. If the organization handles sensitive personal information, protecting access and monitoring for misuse becomes critical. If the organization relies on continuous online services, resilience and availability controls become critical. Exam questions often provide hints about what the organization values, such as customer trust, regulatory compliance, or uptime. Those hints tell you what impact looks like, and therefore what controls are most valuable. When you let the scenario guide your priorities, your answers become more consistent. Control prioritization is also about measuring success in simple terms. A control is high value if it reduces the number of incidents, reduces the severity of incidents, or reduces the time to detect and recover. You can think of this as reducing likelihood, reducing impact, or improving response speed. When you evaluate an answer choice, ask which of these outcomes it supports most directly. A control that decreases account compromise frequency is reducing likelihood. A control that limits damage after compromise is reducing impact. A control that helps you notice compromise sooner is improving detection. This mental model makes it easier to compare options even when all of them sound helpful. You are not choosing what sounds strongest. You are choosing what best improves the outcome described in the question. To conclude, managing and mitigating cyber risk through practical control prioritization means choosing safeguards based on likelihood, impact, and feasibility. Effective prioritization focuses first on high-exposure weaknesses and high-value assets, using controls that provide broad risk reduction and align directly with the scenario's main security objective. Prevention is important, but it must be balanced with detection and recovery, and sometimes compensating controls are needed when ideal solutions are not possible. Dependencies matter, so visibility and process often come before advanced defenses. If you remember one decision rule from this episode, let it be this. When choosing what control to prioritize, identify the asset and the most likely path to harm. Then select the control that most directly reduces that likelihood or impact with the least unnecessary complexity.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.